Oh, yes.
Hello, I'm Jupiter Exile. I often tell people I'm old for my age. You can guess my age in the comments if you want. I love 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. I think simplicity and accessibility are important to a tabletop experience, and 5th edition has allowed many newcomers to explore the hobby. If you've played 5th edition for a while, you probably know that the balancing is a little rough around the edges. It's a good framework with some notable oversights. Part of what's cool about D&D is the ability to make up your own stuff and correct those oversights, but what makes for a good correction? What's fair to add to the game? I've seen a lot of online horror stories about things that have been added to the game that have completely screwed up the balance. I've seen some stories about some cool stuff too that really added to the experience. This is a complicated topic. There's a lot of examples to draw from, so this might turn into a bit of a longer video. I'm going to make sure we've got chapters in the bottom if you want to skip around to talk specifically about spells or class features or anything. But all in all, we're talking about homebrew. But what is homebrew? Homebrew is just a term for your or somebody else's homemade content. It's the garage beer of D&D. It's fun to make, and it can be really great if you know what you're doing. I use homebrew to refer to custom backgrounds, archetypes, class features, spells, and magic items. Most of what I can cover in the video is going to be on magic items and spells. Those are kind of your most fluid mechanics to work with in terms of creating something new. And I think of homebrew as being something separate from house rules. Some people would refer to these interchangeably, that a house rule is a homebrewed thing. That's not wrong, it's just not the way I use the terms. A house rule is a change to the mechanisms of the game that apply to all of the players, whereas homebrew I think of as something that's more contained and portable, like a singular item that could move from campaign to campaign. House rules are good for adding complexity to a system or correcting a system oversight, but maybe delving more into something that D&D 5th doesn't really have rules for, or helping speed up a situation that you see at the table very often. It can help out with getting the game to suit a certain campaign feel. Some of the most popular house rules are about kind of recovery rates and things like that. So you can use hit dice and healing magic to work more like healing surges from 4th edition. A simple house rule is using an hourglass to time people's turns in combat so that combat doesn't stretch on forever. One really good house rule is to put a hard ban on using any kind of mind-affecting spells on other player characters. You shouldn't need to use that house rule if you're playing with good players, but not everybody has the luxury of having kind of trusted friends who've been at the game for a long time. So that can be a good house rule to have. You can also have house rules that just kind of give people a little bump up or help them get more engrossed in the world, like giving all of the players an extra language to work with so that they can be more integrated with like a multicultural kind of cities and settings. If you want to make really big house rule changes like lingering injury mechanics where players are going to have to get over broken bones over the course of multiple weeks, or if you want to have a sanity loss system, like a Cthulhu type of thing, just use the systems where those mechanics already exist. You'll be better off not using D&D 5th to do that. There are plenty of systems that already have more grit or more crunch, and if that's the flavor you're looking for in your game, it's way better to go to a game that has that flavor than try to make 5th edition D&D feel that way, because the system's going to fight you at every step. Why use homebrew? If you're going to put together some homebrew, you should know your goals. What are the problems that you're trying to solve? What's going to make the game more fun, not only for the players, but also for the DM, which might be you. Maybe you're a player watching this and you want to convince a DM. Equally valid. First reason you might want to do this is to correct some power imbalance. Not all classes in 5th edition are created equal. Paladins are really strong. Barbarians are just fun to play, but not as strong as paladins, just straight up. Wizards are really good. Sorcerers are really good at doing damage, but not really good at a lot of other things that the wizard is good at. If you have a player who's being outshined at the table by virtue of just the class and race they picked, maybe you'd like to make a homebrew item that expands one of their class features or one of their racial abilities. Some of the spells are a bit weak, or committing to memorizing those spells aren't that fun. So if a player's committed to those choices, you may want to give them some help. Your party healer may appreciate an item that lets them keep Revivify memorized, because the party will pressure them to make sure they have Revivify memorized, and that's going to eat at what they can hold on to in terms of the spells that are available. You want them to be able to serve the party and get along with their friends at the table, but they also deserve the capacity to, have fun and cast the spells they want to cast. I like creating items or features that adjust the Dragonborn Breath Weapon. It is really weak the way it exists currently in 5th edition. Looks like they're going to be buffing it in one way or another for the 1 D&D release, so it might be less necessary to buff that, but you can have... I like making a combo setup where they'll train with some kind of Dragonborn mentor, and he will allow them to cloak their weapon in the energy of their breath weapon, so that after doing the breath weapon, the next attack gets an extra die of bonus damage. It just encourages them to vary up what they're doing within a fight and rewards them for doing an action. It's kind of normally suboptimal. You can let the 4 elements monk, maybe your Dragonborn is a 4 elements monk, and you let them change the element of their breath weapon or the shape of their breath weapon. This is just super easy stuff to let your players do. Multi-class characters often wind up outside of the power curve one way or another. Either they've got a combo that is very functional and it's kind of outpacing other people at the table, or they have a combo that is not very functional. Maybe they're multi-classing more for the flavor of it. Adding a homebrewed spell or something along those lines can add synergy to the classes that they're building between, and maybe help fix an action economy problem. A lot of multi-classes have an overburdened bonus action, or they'll have a need to concentrate on something even though they're going into melee with a Gish build, and you might want to help them keep concentration on a basic spell. If they just need to cast Bless and then go into melee, them losing that Bless is going to feel really lame. So just don't punish them for going into melee. Give them an item that makes their Bless easier to concentrate on. The next reason you may want to engage in some homebrewing is to lean into the aesthetics that your players are choosing for their characters. I love character theming. Tasha's Cauldron of Everything released some excellent guidance for reflavoring spells to suit your character. As a DM and as a player, I love creating items and spells that emphasize that flavor and theme. For the druid who prefers a very specific animal form, a custom version of that form with upgraded stats is a good idea for the higher levels, so that they don't feel that they have to move away from their preference in order to be mechanically relevant. Maybe they transform into bears, and their character is an apiarist as a hobby, somebody who takes care of bees. You could make them a bee-themed staff. If your bard wants to be a mime, think up special gloves that allow them to cast shield. Or give them an invisible rope of entanglements. They can do the and pull somebody in. It's adorable. If your party is a circus troupe, your lion tamer could really use a magical whip, and there are no magical whips in the Dungeon Master's Guide. You're gonna have to make one up. You could make the magical whip work like a figurine of power. You crack the whip and it summons the lion. Players will often embrace early items as part of their aesthetic. You can get a sword that has a cool story behind it when you're level 4, but by the time you're level 9, maybe it doesn't slap so good. Instead of the player looting a new sword from a dungeon, consider having them take ore back to a blacksmith and do a custom upgrade on the current weapon. So maybe the +1 sword becomes a +1 frost brand instead of just dropping the frost brand by itself the way it exists in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Or if they have a more specific flavor to how their character fights, tune the weapon to fit that flavor and make up something entirely new. Another reason you may want to make homebrew or add homebrew to your game is to add more choices and more mechanical depth to what the players are doing. Sometimes the most optimal thing for characters to do in a fight is just roll attacks and do their damage. It's not very interesting. It'll come back around to their turn and be like, I attack the monster. I miss. And that's turn. And they've got nothing else to do. Homebrewing in some additional daily resources can put some variety back in your combats, or let you push a tougher challenge. Maybe as the DM, you want to put more monsters on the table, so give the players a little bit more power so they can deal with a couple more monsters. If you know that you've given them some kind of tool or ability, you can prompt for that with more challenges in the game. Divinity Original Sin and Divinity 2 have a lot of terrain-modifying spells and interactions, like pouring water on a foe and then electrifying them. You could try and make these kinds of interactions into house rules, but that can be kind of difficult for players to keep track of. It's a little exhausting. You're going to have to think about everything before you get into the game. So instead, you could make a customized version of the Create Water spell that has an extra rule like, if a target inside the radius of this spell takes cold or lightning damage within the next minute, add an additional 2d8 of that damage type. So by putting it on the spell, the player can look at the spell and have the onus of that to remember the mechanics and the effect, and they can use this as kind of a setup for another party member to jump in with one of those damage types, and now you've got a much more interesting, nuanced interaction than what's baseline available in the spell. There are a few items in the Dungeon Master's Guide that provide constant power, like the Flame Tongue. You can create a weaker version of that weapon with a limited number of uses per day, or an equivalent version that applies a stronger effect a limited number of times. Like this is a flaming sword, it does fire damage when you hit, but maybe 3 times per day, it can roar into this great big blaze and do like a fiery smite type of thing. If you're giving it to an Eldritch Knight, maybe they can use their spell slots to fuel it to do a smite type of thing. Don't do that if you have a paladin in your game. Do not steal the thunder from player characters who are already doing a certain thing. I'll circle back around to that point a bit later. Certain actions and spells are inefficient in combat. They're a subpar choice. Your players pick up on this, they know that. You can homebrew a feat that applies the Empower Metamagic to healing spells a certain number of times per day, or make an illusion spell that allows you to make a hide check as part of the spell cast. So you put more efficiency back into those actions that are normally inefficient, so the players feel less punished for their choices. They can have more interesting time doing those non-standard actions in combat. Another thing you can do with Homebrew is to kind of reward characters who want to be crafting type characters. So the D&D 5th edition crafting rules leave a lot to be desired. They're really bare bones rules, almost to the point of being irrelevant. But the sensation of crafting something and upgrading your gear is really cool. I play a bunch of Monster Hunter, and it's really fun to get the full set together for a tough monster. You get a really clear idea visually of your character, and aesthetically, that really comes together. In FromSoft games, when you beat a boss, you can always go somewhere or talk to somebody to get that boss's soul, or I forget what they call it in Elden Ring, but you can make it into a weapon and get access to their weapons and special attacks. Unless you're playing Sekiro, you have different special attacks, don't worry about it. Apply that directly to your D&D game. Run a boss and have him do a cool thing with a weapon or with a special ability, maybe it's a monster. Let players craft that in. Have that mechanic ready. It doesn't have to be the full boss's mechanic, it can be a pared down version, but let them get the thing they just went up against. They're gonna have a blast with that. I've got a few homebrew examples. These are very simple changes. I've seen some of these kinds of things at other tables before because they're very simple pivots to make on the existing material, to the extent that it doesn't really need a full write-up. For one, you can do a Primal Knight. The Eldritch Knight is an arcane fighter. The divine version of the fighter would be the Paladin. The Primal Spell List version of the fighter is theoretically the ranger, but ranger is not a great class. It's an odd duck, it's a black sheep. Wizards doesn't know what they want to do with the ranger. They've reworked the ranger 3 times now since the release of 5th edition. It's had 2 separate Unearthed Arcana versions, and now there is a 1 D&D version of the ranger. It's never quite the same. They don't get the heavy armor that the fighter gets. The unique features that you get as a ranger don't match up to the smite or grace that form the backbone of the paladin class. So rather than navigate this identity crisis at your table, you can just make an Eldritch Knight that uses the druid spell list and gets transmutation spells instead of evocations. So that character can get access to bark skin. They can use, I believe, Shrink and Grow is a transmutation spell. I can't remember if Enhance Ability is a transmutation spell, but it's going to be a more utility-oriented build. They might get access to things like Entangle or Plant Growth. It's probably better to make sure that they do. It's just, if those aren't transmutation, just add them into the list. But you can get a handy-dandy, slightly different archetype with that. You don't need to change almost any other feature in the entirety of the Eldritch Knight's feature list. Just put them on the different spell list setup. Similarly, you can adjust an Arcane Trickster. You can have an Arcane Trickster use Druid spells and call it the Fey Trickster, or have it use Divine spells and make it the Fiendish Trickster. You're going to have to change them similarly because Arcane Tricksters are locked to illusions and enchantments. All illusions are on the Arcane list, so if you are moving them to another list, they need something other than illusions to feel good about playing the class. You can easily add, and I suggest as the DM, you keep a strict control over this kind of thing if you want to add it. You can add mana or stamina potions to the game that when a character drinks them, they trigger Arcane Recollection without doing a short rest, or they can restore other class features like Action Surge or give a monk back their key. This is a useful resource for controlling the pacing of the game or putting resource management more in the hands of the players without them having to badger you after getting a short rest. Short rests are sometimes narratively inconvenient. It doesn't always make sense for the characters to take a 1-hour break to do something. So you can give them an item that makes them not need that. Another simple change you can make is a few different archetypes can be easily transplanted into another class. You can take the Beastmaster Ranger archetype and just take the Beastmaster part and attach that to a Druid, and just have a Beastmaster Druid instead of a Beastmaster Ranger, and it basically works with very few tweaks. You can take the Battlemaster archetype that is available to fighters, you can just make that available wholesale to a Ranger, a Rogue, or even a Barbarian, and any of those classes could play that archetype perfectly fine, because the archetype itself doesn't really lean on any of the fighter class features. It's on the fighter stylistically, but you can change that in any way you want. You could have a Battlemaster Monk. You could almost do a Way of the Shadow Rogue, which is a monk archetype being transplanted onto a rogue. You could make a Battlemaster Wizard. I don't think you should. I don't know why you would want to do that, but it's your game. Go off. Do what you want. Magic items are grouped into uncommon, rare, very rare, and legendary. There are also artifacts. Don't worry about those. If you want to homebrew an artifact, I can't help you. Those things are crazy. The brackets get wider as you move into more powerful stuff, which steadily makes things a bit more difficult to compare and balance. Uncommon items cover items with 100 to 500 gold cost. Lower than that is considered a common item. It's generally not magical. Rare items are between that 500 and 5,000, and very rare items are from 5,000 to 50,000, with legendary items being more expensive than that. Any consumable, like a potion or a scroll or arrows or bolts, are considered half cost. So if it's a rare scroll, that's theoretically something like 2,500 gold type of value. Whatever you want to make in terms of your homebrew, try and place it somewhere on this spectrum and consider it as being that value of treasure or quest. So when you want to drop this item, think to yourself, I want for this wizard's tower to have maybe 4,000 gold worth of treasure at the end of the adventure. And then think maybe he's got a rare item that's worth about 2,000, some amount of like artwork and coins to cover the rest. Your most typical homebrew should probably be an uncommon item. This will cover a lot of convenient effects, things that make broader options for the party. They can do a lot of benefits to skill checks, or they can provide other benefits or bonuses that are very contextual. The most powerful uncommon items that are available in the first party published material, like the DMG and the Of Everything books, is probably the Cloak of Elvenkind and the Broom of Flying. Cloak of Elvenkind provides constant advantage on stealth checks, and the Broom of Flying lets a character fly. And it doesn't really have more rules beyond that, except the fact that the flying is tied to the broom. You should probably force the character to make ride checks or some other check to remain on the broom whenever they take damage, because it's disgustingly good for the amount of cost that the first party material suggests it should have. Both of these items near constant benefits with combat utility. Your uncommon homebrew items should be weaker than these items, either because their benefits are not constant or because their benefits do not have combat utility. Rare items more commonly have static combat benefits, such as a bonus to AC, attack rolls, or damage. They can have higher level spells on them, or other effects that have a big impact within a scene. There are a lot of serviceable magic weapons in this bracket, as well as armor of resistance, most of the figurines of power that conjure fairly reliable kind of summoned creatures, and several staves and wands also sit at the rare bracket. Very rare items range from something that is useful to something that is campaign defining. It is a huge bracket of items. Very rare items sometimes provide a powerful spell as a passive effect. These can be really complex. They can provide 3 or 4 or even 5 benefits. Very rare staves can provide a huge range of spells. Weapons and armor can provide big bonuses. I usually make a concept of one very rare item per character, and I might pass that out to the player as a rare item that will grow into a very rare item over time, steadily gaining its power as they kind of complete objectives. Homebrewing a proper legendary item or an artifact requires that you turn off the part of your brain that cares about the game balance. I don't usually play the game in the level brackets that bandy about legendary items. A character who is wielding a legendary item is of military relevance on an international scale. It is reasonable for a foreign military to try and gather intel on that character as a security objective. That's the level you have to be thinking on when you are looking at dispensing items of this power to the party. Something like a Holy Avenger, there should probably only be one of them in the world where your game is taking place, unless it's a plot point that there is more than one of them. The Greyhawk setting has 9 swords that are referred to as the Swords of Answering, each of them being legendary. But that's the kind of discrete quantity of legendary items that you want to be thinking about, and the way that kind of fits in the world. One important element you need to think about when you are homebrewing magic items for your game is attunement. Most characters only have 3 attunement slots, so it's important to consider whether or not attunement is going to be required for your items. Artificers can gain some extra attunement slots, and in 1D&D, the rogue gets a 4th attunement slot, I think at 10th level. Might be a little different from that. The system doesn't make hard statements or rules about what does or doesn't require attunement, so you have to kind of reverse engineer the rules for attunement, or you can listen to what I'm about to tell you, because I've already done that part. If the item allows any kind of reaction or other out-of-turn effect, it requires attunement. Any kind of reaction-based interaction should be more expensive than a standard type of spellcast. Like, if it's an item that does a first-level spellcast like Burning Hands, that would not require attunement. But if it lets them cast Shield as a reaction, that should require attunement and be more powerful and more expensive, rarer, than the Burning Hands item. If the item adjusts your attributes, it requires attunement. This can be something that sets your strength score to 19, or something that gives a static bonus like a +2 to dexterity. Both of those would require attunement, though they're somewhat different rarities. If the item can cast spells of 2nd level or above, it probably requires attunement. You can sometimes give leeway for spells that don't require concentration, or recovery spells like Lesser Restoration. This is just for being kind of fun or fair. You might want those recovery spells to be in the party without having one of the characters feel like they're obligated to use an attunement slot in order to manage that. But a 2nd level offensive spell, especially one that requires concentration, should definitely require attunement. The easiest example of this is the Wand of Web. If the item provides resistance to a damage type, it requires attunement. Resistance to a damage type is a pretty proprietary kind of thing to have. When the players know what they're going to be up against, having resistance to the favored damage type of that creature is a huge boon in terms of their effective HP, especially like Dragon Breaths and things like that. There are various classes that give some kind of a resistance, and you don't want to have players in a circumstance where they have resistance to 3 or 4 different things. It will make them feel less specialized and more generally powerful when a wizard throws like 3 different spells at them and they resist everything. If the item provides a bonus to AC or saving throws, it will almost always require attunement, unless it is a shield. This is an element of balancing that I can read and derive from the Dungeon Master's Guide without necessarily agreeing with it. I think if it provides bonuses to AC, it should always require attunement, because AC is just incredibly powerful in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. But it's also weirdly powerful. If you give AC to somebody who doesn't have a lot of AC already, that is less powerful than giving an AC bonus to somebody who already has a bunch. It's a very all-or-nothing resource. So if you allow more AC to go to a fighter or a paladin, they become very strong very fast. If you allow more AC to go to a rogue or a wizard, it's not a big deal, because their AC, they can't really get it that high anyway. So you're just providing them little marginal benefits. The DMG and the way it considers balancing, holding something in your hands is a kind of potent interaction. So they think it is okay to give more AC to a magic shield, and you see that happen in the DMG at various times. But once a shield starts giving a +3 or +4 bonus to armor class, it gets really difficult to kind of balance things and rein in that character. If you give an AC bonus to something like robes or leather armor, it's not that big a deal, especially if there's already an armor in that armor category that provides that bonus. Like +1 leather armor, studded leather already is +1 leather armor, so it's not valuable to give that AC bonus on that item when there's already a choice in the same bracket. One exception to this is heavy armor and the fact that plate armor exists. Plate armor is already costed like a rare magic item in Dungeons & Dragons, and that's the way you should think about plate armor. Don't give out plate armor until you're ready to be giving out rare magic items, because it's the same thing. If the item provides a bonus to saving throw DCs for your spells, it requires attunement. The game considers saving throw DCs to be more meaningful than attack roll bonuses. I think the reason the game considers this to be the case is that spellcasters are oftentimes more powerful than martial attackers, and you can get the ability to make multiple attacks per round, but the number of saving throws you prompt per round is generally just going to be 1, and that is more impactful. And the effects of saving throws are often more meaningful than the effects of landing or missing a singular attack. A weapon can add +1 to hit and damage, and inflict bonus damage or have a bonus critical effect against a specific enemy type without requiring attunement. It needs to do something more than that for attunement to be required. If an item consistently gives a damage bonus, like it always does an extra d6 of damage, that is more likely to require attunement than something like a Mace of Smiting that has a contextual damage bonus. The Mace of Smiting, I believe, is against undead. It might be against constructs. I think I'm getting it mixed up with another magic item, but that mace doesn't require attunement. I believe there's a Giant's Bane axe or something else that's anti-giant that also doesn't require attunement, because while it has a +1 to attack and damage against everything, its additional benefits are exclusive to giants. Even in a campaign where you're fighting giants all the time, you don't need to make that require attunement, because it's the contextual nature of the benefit is already going to kind of drive the player to do a specific kind of interaction to make use of it, and in other general cases, it's not really magical enough to worry about. Now, what kinds of items do you want to make? I find that most of the homebrew items that I make are bows, wands, spellbooks, and staves. The DMG does not have enough bows for the number of player characters who want to use bows, and the bows that are in there are usually really powerful. You don't have a lot of mid-grade bows. Staves are just a very flexible type of item that can be very easily customized to a player character's focus or their signature spells. Casters who focus on less powerful options can really use a staff that helps those less powerful options flourish. And the items I envision for those kinds of characters are usually like wands, spellbooks, and staves. Okay, we're going to run through a couple sample homebrew items. So, starting from character aesthetic, let's say we've got a druid who often turns into a spider form because they like moving on the ceiling. They just think that's the coolest thing. So, if I want to give them an uncommon item, I can start from working with the Wand of Web as a baseline, but I'm going to make it more druid flavored. If I make it a staff, it can be a viable target for shillelagh when they're outside of animal form, so that helps them with like baseline druid mechanics. For some additional effects on it, I'm going to add web to their spell list. Normally, only Underdark land druids get this, so if that would be their character would almost have to be a drow for that to feel right. That's weird. Or maybe they're fungal. Maybe they're a myconid. Myconid should be a playable race. I'll make the druid class a requirement for getting the full benefits of the item. Like we'll say, in order to get this and this benefit, you have to be a druid. Maybe you have to be a druid to attune to the item. We can do that. We'll say that aesthetically, when they transform while they're holding the staff, the item merges with them and they get like this sinister glowing mark on like their spidery abdomen. They'll have the ability to cast web and spider climb spells while they're in any form that has a web ability, and that any creature affected by their spider climb spell will gain the web walk ability from the giant spider stat block. So this is helping them interact with the party. It's giving them a reason to cast Spider Climb, which I think is a very cool, kind of underutilized spell, partially because Spider Climb is a little difficult to represent at the table. You can't really like have a mini displayed as halfway up a wall, but it's really cool. I like walking on walls as a player. The web walk ability just means that a character or a creature is immune to webbing type effects. I think the web spell per raw doesn't really have a provision for this, but the webbing abilities that are available to giant spiders have something about this. And as a DM, when you're creating a spider layer type of thing, you should put out some kind of webbing obstacles and things like that, which the game doesn't really give you a backing for, but you should do it anyway. As compensations for putting extra powers on the item, I'll reduce the charges of the wand. The Wand of Web has 7 charges on it, and you can cast web all the time. You can take it down to like 2 or 3 if we're doing this, because the primary benefits they're getting are more about the spell modification and the extra throughput. And also, I hate the provision on wands that say, if you spend the last charge, roll a d20, on a 1, the item is destroyed. It is a super random provision that doesn't come up very often, and if it does come up, that's a huge bummer. Just strike that rule, it's dumb. If the druid that you're looking at making this for is a moon circle druid, their spider forms are going to turn out pretty weak, so they've just got less effective HP than other forms. So we can add a clause that any spider form gains like 20 hit points when they are transformed into it. You could do this in hit dice, but it might be a little complicated to do. It's a little difficult to balance the extra HP the druids get. It's a really outstanding feature in their kit. If we want to make it a rare item instead of an uncommon item, we can say that it also gives +1 to their attack and damage while in a spider form, and +1 to the save DCs for web abilities and spells. Like, making this in terms of hard mechanics is a little difficult, because in terms of hard mechanics, there's not actually a link between the web spell and a spider's web ability. But as a table, you can just understand what that is. You can also, if you're doing it at the rare level, give the staff itself the ability to deliver spider poison on a successful hit 3 times per day. So even if they're in their druid form, they're doing spellcaster stuff, they can feel like they are a spider druid doing a poison attack. It's just cool stuff. So for the next sample homebrew item, this is less theoretical. This is something that we actually that I actually made in the game and we implemented. One of the players that I had was a Twilight Cleric, and I found that he was getting kind of ditched in combat on open ground because he's like wearing heavier armor. He was like kind of lagging behind, and we had other player characters with extra movement that were just dashing super far ahead, and it was making it difficult for him to participate in combat. He was making frequent use of the Moonbeam spell, so we created a piece of armor that added extra utility to his Moonbeam spell. It was an uncommon item, no attunement requirement, and it is, while concentrating on Moonbeam, allies would be exempt from the damage of Moonbeam. That's fairly powerful, and I allowed him to count himself as being in the Moonbeam's space during his turn. So he couldn't use this property to do attack of opportunity through the Moonbeam, but he could still make melee attacks through the Moonbeam or use it to deliver touch spells. Moving the Moonbeam is also an action, so this is a very mild kind of thing, because if they need to update the location of their Moonbeam per that action, then they won't really be able to make use of this benefit. But if they don't have to update where their Moonbeam is, they can do other touch effects through the Moonbeam, or maybe do something that has like a 30-foot range from the Moonbeam space. And when they use this property, there's like a ghostly Twilight version of the character's arm that appears within the moonlit space. So this is a very small kind of power tweak, but it's very stylistic and cool. So this is pretty easy to implement. Gave just like a little bump to make things a little more convenient for this player, or feel a little bit cooler about using his spell. And also, removing the friendly fire effect from a Moonbeam is reducing a possible frustration point that could occur for that player or for others at the table if they wound up being in Moonbeam damage while they were trying to participate in combat. It does remove a bit of the finesse of the spell because they no longer have to position it carefully, but most of the targets I was having them fight were at like a huge or a large size, so it's not that difficult to position the Moonbeam anyway. Might as well just make it convenient, and allowing them to do like touch-based healing spells through the Moonbeam gives them a really good kind of utility level within the party. For that matter, you could also cast Inflict Wounds through the Moonbeam, so if another party member is tangling up a monster, you can deliver crazy damage with that effect. But it's still fair, because you can deliver crazy damage anyway. It's just what the class does. I think ranged characters don't get enough to do in the published material. It doesn't really feel like you're playing a meaningful archer without a stock of magic arrows, but we don't get a lot of guidance on making magic arrows or sample magic arrows in the books. I feel like rangers need to have special shot spells the way that paladins have smite spells. You can actually take the arcane archer features that exist for that class and make them into spells. That's a decent kind of homebrew to go about. I think we need to really get features like this onto the primal spell list up in 1D&D. I don't think it's going to cause a problem to make these kinds of things available to druids either. There aren't that many druid builds that I see emphasizing a bow, because it's like another stat that the druid would have to get into. The balancing trick about adding in magical ammunition is that most ranged characters can attack twice per turn, possibly more, and you can quickly deplete a stock of magical arrows, depending on how the mechanics for the bundle of arrows are actually set up. The DMG talks about magic ammunition as if you get just one shot of that magical arrow, and the expanded crafting rules in Xanathar's guide cover scrolls and potions being made in a faster time bracket than usual magic items for their tier, but there's no special table for ammunition. There is nothing that talks about making more than one ammunition at once, or making them faster. Ammunition is a consumable, so it is implied that you make it with half the time and half the cost as a non-consumable item, but it's still really annoying. What we've done at my table is we assume that a homebrew ammunition item is made in some amount of a stack. Like you make them 10 or 20 at a time, and you just try to compare it to a scroll in terms of determining the rarity. An arrow that forces a save against fairy fire for a single target for a single round is more similar to a scroll of guiding bolt than it is to a scroll of fairy fire. There's a few trade-offs. If you let them do that with an attack action, that would be different than if you had them do a magic action that obligated all of their attacks for a round. If you mimic a spell that requires concentration, like you let them fire off an arrow of web, then that effect should also require concentration. Don't let people get around concentration effects by tying it onto an arrow, or a scroll also requires concentration. The benefit of potions is that a potion doesn't require concentration when you drink it, so be careful about the rarity you set on any custom potions. They can kind of get out of control. The additional effects from Frostbolt, Spectral Grasp, Shocking Grasp, and Gust can easily be added on to Homebrew Arrows. So those would be slowing movement, preventing healing, preventing attacks of opportunity, or pushing 5 feet. You can easily make those effects that people can access with more than one attack per round, with just a couple caveats. Some of these effects were also implemented into the new weapon systems in 1D&D. The slowing effect is in there. Being unable to make attacks of opportunity was not included. That's the Shocking Grasp effect. 5 feet of knockback was implemented into 1D&D as an effect you can get on a weapon. I think it's actually 10 feet in 1D&D. You can also add a Vicious Mockery effect to an arrow pretty simply, and allow them to get access to that without too much cost. Multiple times per turn they can fire it. You want to make sure it doesn't stack up on the same target. Similarly, you can't let the slowing effect stack up on the same target. It gets unfun really fast. Any effect that a Warlock Invocation can add to Eldritch Blast is going to be fair game to add to an arrow, because firing an arrow and a single Eldritch Blast are a very similar amount of action economy. The most typical reasons for homebrewing spells are to add an upscaling component or create a very specific interaction. The baseline grease spell in 5th edition isn't flammable, for instance. You can easily modify the spell to ignite when exposed to fire and cause extra damage. I think that was removed because it was considered to be a bit niche. Another good case for homebrew is the creation of limited versions of certain broadly applicable high-level spells. Wall of Stone is a 5th level spell because it has a lot of versatility and interesting options. You could create a lesser Wall of Stone that has more placement restrictions, like maybe you cannot fully encase somebody with this lower level Wall of Stone. In terms of more complicated interactions, gas-based spells like Cloud Kill indicate that they're dispersed by wind-based effects. You could create a variant wind-based spell that moves or splits cloud-based effects instead of ending them, if you've got a character that, by virtue of their aesthetic, wants to be using a lot of wind and cloud-based effects. It's a very situational type of spellcast, too situational to be in any officially printed material, but you could get a niche for this either in a cooperative strategy within the party, or the players might want a spell like this if they would need to counter a specific big bad that favors gas-based effects. Homebrewing spells is more straightforward than homebrewing items because spell levels compared to item rarity are really well defined in terms of their power, and the accessibility of spell slots is already directly tied into character level. There are a few golden rules to follow if you're homebrewing some spells. Any fully disabling effect must allow a saving throw. Silence, for example, is not considered fully disabling because you can move out of the effect, but any immobilizing effect is considered fully disabling. There's a little bit of ambiguity about what the game considers to be fully disabling, but you need to think about whether the monster or the player that is subject to the effect still has meaningful choices after the effect has been applied. For very high-level spells, such as the power word spells, those don't function off a saving throw, they function off of a check of the health total. If you are making a very high-level spell, you can have something other than a saving throw that determines the interaction. There's also kind of rules of thumbs about what kind of saving throw the spell should call for, and if you're doing something outside of that norm, you need to make the spell a little weaker to compensate. For instance, most damaging spells work off of dexterity saving throws, and that infers what you can apply those to, the kinds of creatures that are resistant to it, etc. But Cone of Cold works off of a Constitution saving throw, which makes it a rogue killer spell, because it's not going to be subject to the rogue's evasion, it's going to be set off of their preferred saving throw type. So there are advantages to having that different saving throw, even though that spell is worse to use against a lot of monsters. It does less damage per level than something like a fireball because it has that unique benefit, or that unique utility. Any damaging effect must allow counterplay, but not necessarily a saving throw. Spike Growth is a good example of a spell that causes damage with no save. You can allow immobile effects that prompt an interaction or certain wall spells to cause damage without having any kind of saving throw. If that effect can fully immobilize, then it still needs a saving throw, even if whether or not they engage with that thing is fully under the prerogative of the player or the monster. You still don't want them to become fully disabled without having a saving throw. A spell can cause a lingering effect without concentration, so long as that effect has the potential to friendly fire, and the effect is the only product of the spell. It's a little complicated to say, but I've got some concrete examples. Grease and plant growth are both examples of this, where they cause an effect that lingers in the environment. That effect is indiscriminate in terms of who it affects. The caster has no lasting control over that effect, and the effect is the only thing that the spell does. Ice Storm, by contrast, causes difficult terrain, but it also does damage. So the difficult terrain created by Ice Storm only lasts for 1 round. Anything that does damage cannot also set up a lingering control effect, unless it requires concentration to upkeep the lingering control effect. If you'd like to homebrew an archetype, the simplest way is to mix and match benefits from existing archetypes for other classes. You need to be aware of which levels provide meaningful power and which levels provide utility. The D&D design team has referred to these utilities as ribbon benefits, and replacing a ribbon benefit with direct power is going to make a stronger archetype. They've given more power to archetypes more recently compared to before, where they had more adherence to this ribbon benefit type of design, and it's not too bad to add a little highly contextual power around the level brackets where other classes would get ribbon benefits. Just be aware and keep comparing to what you're trying to build. Here are a few more simple do's and don'ts about making an archetype. Do not include short-term attribute adjustments in any class feature. Adjusting attributes will force a player to make a lot of kind of trickle-down calculations about their secondary statistics. These are annoying to recalculate, and you don't want to have to fiddle with them. D&D 5th edition is all about not having to fiddle with this extra math along the way. In the same vein as this, do not include short-term +1 or -1 effects. Try using advantage, plus or minus a d4, or a dice resource pool like the Battlemaster's superiority dice. It's more fun for people to roll, you get more of that nice dice clacking sound, you get them a resource to think about, or something along those lines, and you shortcut any of that minor math. Do not give an archetype resistance to more than 1 damage type. Getting 1 resistance to a damage type is pretty fine. There are a number of archetypes, especially spellcaster archetypes within the cleric and the wizard, that get this sort of benefit around level 10. But if you give a player character access to more than 1 resistance within the same archetype, you're giving them like really blanket power. The notable exception to this, and maybe the exception that sets the rule or demonstrates the rule, would be the Bear Totem Barbarian. But the Bear Totem Barbarian, while they are expanding the resistance to cover a lot of things, it's modifying a class feature that would already be providing a broad resistance. It is best not to replicate the effects of a feat. Feats are more specific and impactful than class archetypes. So if you implement a feat as a class archetype feature, that archetype will become the optimal way of accomplishing something that's very niche. You're gonna hand somebody an optimized build on a silver platter. It's the kind of interaction that's not healthy for your table. You can adjust the attacking attribute for the character, but never allow a character to attack with Constitution. So you can have an archetype that allows a character to make their attacks with Intelligence, or their attacks with Wisdom. Usually you want to restrict the weapon types that they're allowed to do this with. For instance, you don't want somebody using Intelligence to attack with a greatsword, because you're kind of violating an aesthetic if you do that. You don't want somebody to be using Wisdom to attack with a battle axe, because the battle axe is kind of iconically a strength weapon. But you can have somebody attack with a quarterstaff using almost any attribute at all, and it's still fair. And indeed, the quarterstaff in the game, if you're a monk, you can attack with it using dexterity. If you are a druid, you can attack with it using Wisdom. If you are a warlock, you can attack with it using Charisma. So there are already established precedents in the game for using any of these things to attack. Don't let anybody attack using Constitution at any point in time. The fact that Constitution provides health is already a substantial niche for that attribute. You will notice Constitution does basically nothing else across almost the entire remainder of the game, because health is already very powerful. If you allow somebody to stat up their health at the same time they are statting up their offense, they're going to be out of control, just implicitly. Adding skill proficiencies or tool proficiencies or languages is a good way to define an archetype, but do not add expertise to an archetype unless you are building an archetype for a class that already has some access to expertise. Expertise is a fairly proprietary benefit that applies chiefly to rogues and to bards. In 1 D&D, this is being expanded to include rangers as well as artificers. Artificers are kind of an outlier. They have a little access to expertise right now that might be broader when we eventually see a 1 D&D artificer, but for now, they really only have it for toolkits. It's very niche. Expertise is a very powerful feature, sometimes a very frustrating feature to plan around as a DM, so you want to make sure nobody is picking up expertise in a casual way. It needs to be a big obligation they're setting up for their character to get that feature. If the class is capable of casting spells, all archetypes for the class should include domain spells. This is something that has been admitted by the dev team as being an oversight in their design of older class archetypes. All of their newer archetypes in Tasha's and other supplemental material, they all have domain spells. The big outliers that are lacking these domain spells in the original book are those for the Ranger and the Sorcerer. All the Paladin Oaths have always had domain spells. All the Cleric domains have domain spells. That's where domain spells kind of get their name. More up-to-date Druid circles, they'll all have domain spells. Even if the Druid circle is not quite like the Land Druid, they still get land spells effectively. You want to make sure to carry that forward. If a player is looking at their archetype choices, and one of their archetype choices does or does not contain domain spells, that is a big difference in terms of how many spells they can memorize and have access to, and it's going to make an archetype feel really underpowered if you're lacking that. Lastly, you want to avoid any egregious changes to the action economy, such as changing an action to a bonus action. Adjustments like this are fine within the game, there's plenty of precedent for them within the game, but they're the purview of the main class, not the purview of an archetype. If the main class has some things that are changed into bonus actions already, such as through the Rogue's Cunning action, you may be able to add additional effects to that bonus action list without breaking things down too much, but you need to be very restrictive because the ability to do something as a bonus action is an important proprietary aspect of the various classes in the game. The biggest exception to this are the Druid archetypes, which tend to do some kind of wild shape alternative as a bonus action. You can easily homebrew within certain features that are already present in the game for certain archetypes and classes. For instance, you can easily homebrew additional maneuvers for the Battlemaster archetype. This can help a lot if you've transplanted the archetype to another class. Like if you've allowed a monk to be a Battlemaster, you can create more things within the Battlemaster that appeal to wisdom or feel monk-like. You can create something teamwork-oriented that works within a specific context, like allowing the Battlemaster fighter to move through a spell effect that would normally restrict movement if that spell effect was created by a friendly wizard. So you can have them really synergize with your party's controller. You could have something that's flavored around the fighter's specific weapon. If they want to do like the net and trident and gladiator style, you can have a Battlemaster maneuver that allows them to make a net type attack as a bonus action or something like that. Maybe a bonus action that allows them to follow up on a net hit, which is not really enabled within the current existing Battlemaster archetype, but is kind of a specific fun thing. If you're adding these homebrew effects, you should probably put them outside of the restricted choices that the character needs to make, but have them go through like a training arc to learn this. They're spending time in-game to add this mechanic. it's still eating up their superiority dice when they want to use the ability. So you're working off of a resource they already have, you're giving them options, not power. You can have this based around a magical item that they've acquired. So maybe they can use a Battlemaster maneuver to cause the magic within the item to surge and do like this extra thing. You could also invert this. You could have a magic item that gives them access to a Battlemaster maneuver, and you can pass that off to anybody. That could be held by the party Paladin or the party Berserk Barbarian. The maneuvers added in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything create a few new baselines that you can use to kind of compare from in order to make a new use for Battlemaster maneuvers. You could also add a maneuver that defends an ally or assists in some kind of a check, but be cautious about stepping on the toes of any bards in the party. You do not want to use homebrew mechanics that allow one player to shoehorn in on another player's mechanics. But if the party doesn't have a bard, shoehorn away. You're not stepping on anybody's toes. Go ahead and give the Battlemaster a Battlemaster maneuver that works kind of like bardic inspiration. If nobody's at the table to be concerned or mad about it, it's free game. Invocations are a potent signature feature of the Warlock. You may need to be cautious about loading more features into Eldritch Blast, which already has substantial backing from existing invocations, but if you work out with the player to modify one of those invocations or lock out some of the other invocations, you can add another modification to Eldritch Blast. You could add like a Vicious Mockery effect to Eldritch Blast, but set it up so that they cannot take that as well as Repelling Blast. You could add other spell-like features or make some non-damaging spells into at-will effects. One of the signature things of being a warlock is the ability to, through an invocation, cast something like Silent Image or Disguise Self as an at-will spell. There are a couple other spells that you can meaningfully add to that at-will list without breaking the game. Probably quite a lot, because these are generally first-level magic, and it's usually not worth your action in combat to cast a first-level non-damaging spell once you've gotten above like 6th character level in the game. Meta magic is the defining trait of the sorcerer, but many sorcerers get pigeonholed into damage dealing duty. You can create a meta magic that makes a non-damaging spell broader or more convenient, or does that in a kind of general way. If your sorcerer at the table really loves a particular spell, you could try and make a meta magic that is very fine-tuned to that spell, maybe referencing the damage type or doing a specific adjustment to that spell that changes its area or something else. You could actually make a spell that's normally AoE into something single targeting, which could help it be more compatible with other meta magics that exempt AoEs and require a spell to be single targeting in order for it to be like twin cast or something. Also, in the same vein as helping other people is the purview of the bard, meta magic being the purview of the sorcerer, you don't want to give meta magic to other people at the table if there's already a sorcerer at the table, because you'll be invalidating that sorcerer's choices. But if you don't have a sorcerer in the game, you could provide something like a staff or wand that gives another spellcaster access to certain sorcerer meta magics. That's really relevant, cool power for them. It's giving them another daily resource. They'll have like some sorcery points that are bound to the item. But if you have a sorcerer at the table, never create or add a homebrew like this, because you will be stealing their thunder hardcore. Lastly, cleric domains are a good mechanism for setting up a faction or religion within the campaign. The Ravnica sourcebook adds 10 domain spell lists, one for each of the guilds. These get applied as part of a custom background, so if you take, for instance, the Gruul background, you have access to those Gruul domain spells. This adds a lot of flavor to spellcasters and really helps them fit the world, and you have an expectation when you look at a character within the game based on kind of their cultural stylings or what they're wearing. You can suss out their background. You're going to know they have access to certain kinds of magic. It helps like inform things and create a good through line within the campaign. In the interest of holding this video to a finite length, I can't be exhaustive. This is really a sky is the limit sort of topic. I may release another video down the line that is just a series of ideas or examples of homebrew. If you want to contribute your own homebrew to possibly a future video, I can expand on any ideas you might have the breadcrumbs for, or critique anything that you've fully created. We can talk about whether it's a good idea or whether I think it's going to completely upend your table. Post your questions in the comments. I'll respond to whatever I can in written form, and maybe also in a later video. Thank you for listening. This has been Jupiter Exile. I hope we wander again soon.